What is existentialism? Simply put, it is a system of philosophical thought developed mostly by European thinkers during the 20th century. But that doesn't tell you much about what that system is. To really understand existentialism, we have to begin in the 19th century with Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard laid the foundation for the first and most basic component of existentialism, the idea that existence precedes essence. According to Kierkegaard, a person's true identity, or their form, is not any preordained label or classification that a person may fall within, such as a soldier, clergyman, nurse, or mother. Kierkegaard proposes that a person's form must first and last be related to existence, and in this regard he must have at his disposal the poetic, the ethical, the dialectical, the religious. Inherent in our ability to construct our identities from all facets of life is a freedom from the constraints of these labels. People have the agency to think for themselves, with all thought based on one constant supposition, that we and the things that we experience exist. Kierkegaard takes his position a step further with the concept of authenticity. One may suppose that the freedom of choice formula means a person can wish to be anything and attain that goal through the act of wishing itself. However, Kierkegaard calls this act of merely wishing for self-change bad faith. Kierkegaard states that instead, we are defined by our actions and are responsible for those actions. For example, a person may choose to act cruelly, and would thus be described by others as a cruel person, based on their cruel actions. They would also be held responsible for these actions, rather than them being ascribed to human nature. As Jean-Paul Sartre writes in his work Existentialism is a Humanism, man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. But the ability to choose and bear responsibility for one's actions means that a person could also choose to act in a different way, to be a good person instead of a cruel person. People can choose to be good or bad, but are neither entirely. All of this assumes people are acting as they choose, not acting as they think they should, which would be inauthentic. As we choose what action to take, the concept of facticity comes into play. Facticity is defined by Sartre in being and nothingness as the in itself. In relation to a person's life, their facticity would be their past. However, this doesn't mean that a person is defined entirely by their past, as that would mean the person was ignoring the present and the future, and thus being inauthentic. On the other hand, facticity never states that one's past has no role in the decisions they make in the present, because doing so would be denying the existence of the past and thus also being inauthentic. Facticity is a product of the freedom that existential knowledge affords us. Let's consider a scenario involving two men. The first man cannot remember any part of his past, while the second has full memory of past events. Both men have long criminal histories. However, the man with no memory does not commit further felonies, while the man with full memory continues to break the law, believing that his past actions have trapped him in a life of crime. We all lie somewhere between these two extremes. We don't act entirely unaware of our past, nor do we let it rule our present and future actions completely. Rather, we choose how much our past, our facticity, influences our actions and ultimately who we are. This also means that we cannot place the blame for our actions on our past, and must bear responsibility for them and for who we are. The struggle to determine how much our facticity affects our being creates angst. But before we talk about angst, we have to understand the world in which our authentic existences, facticities, and actions operate. Existentialism characterizes the world with the notion of the absurd. This concept states that there is no meaning in the universe besides the meaning we give it. The only objective truth is that we exist. All other meaning we give to the world is subjective to our thoughts, choices, actions, and judgments. This idea also contributes to the perceived amorality or unfairness of the universe. The absurd is irrational. Anything could happen at any time and to anyone. The absurd universe does not care if someone is a good or bad person. The worst can happen to the best, and the best can happen to the worst. So, assuming that our world fits the notion of the absurd, that is, it's meaningless, irrational, and entirely objective, we can then begin to understand how we interact with others. The idea of an other constitutes the awareness of free subjects operating in the objective world in a subjective way that are not us. But these others don't just interact with the world in a subjective way, they also interact with us in a subjective way, specifically through their perceived ideas of ourselves. This idea is called the look. Sartre provides a good example of the way the look affects our self-perceptions. Imagine a person looking through a keyhole. At first, the person is entirely engrossed with the events taking place on the other side of the keyhole, in what is called a pre-reflexive state. But then, another person comes up behind the person at the keyhole, and the floor creaks. Suddenly, the person at the keyhole is aware that they are being observed by an other, and is affected by their expectation that the other perceives them as a peeping Tom, an assessment that would usually beget shame. Another important part of the look is that a person didn't necessarily have to be there. It could have just been the creaking of an old house, and the person at the keyhole might still feel the peeping Tom shame because an other could be watching. These ideas feed into the concept of existential angst. Angst is defined by most existentialist thinkers as a negative emotional product of human freedom and responsibility. Angst sprouts from all the previous concepts that we have discussed. Feelings of inauthenticity, of being trapped by one's own past or forced to deny it, the meaninglessness of the absurd, and the self-perceptive judgments caused by the other and the look all combine to create existential angst. This concept is easily understood if one imagines oneself on the edge of a cliff. A person may feel both fear at the idea of falling off the cliff and dread the notion that they may throw themselves off. The knowledge that nothing predetermines either outcome is the archetypal angst. Angst is separated from fear in that fear has an object, and measures can be taken to deal with that object. However, angst is generated by our own freedom of choice, and our knowledge that the choices we make are wholly our responsibility. The final facet of existentialism is that of despair. Here, despair is defined as a loss of hope in response to a breakdown in one's own identity. Thus, despair can fall on a person if they base their identity on something inauthentic, something fickle in nature. For example, if someone based their entire identity around being a singer, and then lost their ability to sing, they would fall into a state of despair because of this loss of identity. Another important note, someone does not need to be outwardly expressing this despair to be experiencing it. According to Sartre, because there exists no human essence found in conventional reality on which to constitute the individual's sense of identity, despair is a universal human condition. Sartre's claim leaves little light in the seemingly dark world of existential thought, but we can glean a sliver of hope from Kierkegaard's Works of Love, in which he says, "When the God-forsaken worldliness of earthly life shuts itself in complacency, the confined air develops poison, the moment gets stuck and stands still, the prospect is lost, a need is felt for a refreshing, enlivening breeze to cleanse the air and dispel the poisonous vapors lest we suffocate in worldliness. Lovingly to hope all things is the opposite of despairingly to hope nothing at all. Love hopes all things, yet is never put to shame. To relate oneself expectantly to the possibility of the good is to hope. To relate oneself expectantly to the possibility of evil is to fear. By the decision to choose hope, one decides infinitely more than it seems, because it is an eternal decision."